Hi everybody, this is another long video. I'm just going to explain the difference between two terms, at least the way I use them, that are very often conflated and potentially misunderstood as well. That is the word cover and the word turn. So to turn and to cover. To me, they are distinct but very related concepts. If we use them interchangeably, I think it limits the whole voice a little bit, particularly when it comes to unleashing power in the ring. So typically these words are used very, very often by tenors and baritones. Sopranos and mezzos and contraltos and, female voices in general can produce the same acoustic and functional result. In fact, I think they should, but it's going to be in the lower part of their voice. Yeah. And mind you, it's going to have huge impact to the way they sing the top and how good they sound at the top. But typically they can get away with not really tuning the resonance at all, or singing with a strongly efficient sound. They'll get away with it. So they don't tend to talk about it as much, although the really good ones do, in my experience anyhow. And the really good people who teach them do. So I'm going to be relating this mainly to tenors and baritones. I'm just going to use some tenor examples because it's just easier to demonstrate. But the same concept applies. So it is important to understand that you can't separate the acoustical and functional aspects of singing. It is impossible to separate those, both in terms of traditional teaching and in terms of a modern scientific understanding of how the voice actually works. So, covering. A lot of people will use covering as a term for what happens, or what is necessary for a tenor or a baritone to do when they reach the passaggio point in the voice. So for tenors, this is typically around F sharp, and baritones will cover around the E flat or E. I'll just show you something that would be typical of a lot of what a lot of people would be teaching, which is a fairly aggressive covering action right at the passaggio point. So if we take let's take a lighter tenor aria. Una furtiva lagrima, we can find a good example in this. High note here is, and we're starting on an F natural and going to an A flat. So it's something like So there's a huge separation between what happens in the upper middle voice, or the pre-passaggio, as some people call it, and what happens as we turn over into the passaggio itself. The person who's teaching that kind of singing, or the singer who's doing that kind of singing, will tend to conflate the word turn and the word cover. If we use a baritone example, let's take very, very common thing we hear all the time, right? In my own language, both of those examples are covered, right? But they're not really turned. Now, what I mean by that is, you have to understand first what I mean by cover. My definition of cover is basically the acoustical and functional effect that lengthening the vocal tract will have on the voice. Assumes a lot of other stuff is in place first, true, but it's basically a lengthened vocal tract, a yawn in the sound or something like that. Now, the problem with applying this cover so aggressively and suddenly at the passaggio point itself is that you make it really, really difficult for the voice to ring, okay? Now, I did a previous short, or maybe it's a video on YouTube, I can't remember, on squillo. And squillo, I was specifically talking about male voices in the top. The same thing applies to women in the middle voice though, right? As always, it's the same pitches, right? It's the lower, same absolute pitches. It's just the lower voice for them and the higher voice for us. Anyway, and it is the introduction of this acoustical effect into the voice, which can only occur at a certain point, that I would call the turn, right? So when the squillo picks up in dominance in the sound, that's going to be the primary resonance. The reason, at least I think, I'm pretty sure, the reason historically it was called the turn is it feels as if the resonance that you feel in the front kind of shifts. So it's like it turns, right? Makes sense? At least that's how I understand it. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's it. Anyway, so if we were to sing the same phrase from Ul futiva lacrima and put in a more covered quality already in the upper middle, so that's going to be a greater degree of hootiness, yeah, a little bit more of a low larynx position, a kind of different character to it, and I'm going to be able to then turn the high note, yeah, the A flat. So it'll be something like so I don't know if that was obvious from the recording, but the high note there has much more dominance in the squillo, yeah? So rather than being merely covered, it is also turned. That's going to have a massive effect on the degree of resonance in the sound, and therefore the effect in the theater. The top's going to get much louder instead of getting much softer. It's going to also save the voice a little bit of wear and tear. The reason for that is that this sound engages this kind of acoustic feedback loop where the resonance feeds back into the function itself and makes the function stronger and more efficient. So it's a really interesting thing, but it's why, and I'm sure everyone watching this has heard this kind of singer in the theater, which you don't hear so much, unfortunately, but which still exists, where somehow there's particularly, you'll notice the effect with tenors and baritones, where somehow the high notes get much, much, much louder than the middle of the voice. And it's a really curious thing because it seems like they can just do that all night and it's easy for them, but there seems to be limitless resonance. And that is the reason. It's because there is this feedback loop being leveraged in the voice. Yes. Anyway, so that is for me the difference between covering and turning. The covered position, the covered sound is already there in the voice, already from the upper middle. It depends on the voice, depends exactly what you want to do. I mean, there are no real binaries here, but typically I would say from about a B flat for most tenors and about an A flat for most baritone, something like that anyway. We don't want to draw like a line here, but that's basically it. And you're going to be able to leverage this resonance from about an F natural for baritones, roughly speaking, and from about an F sharp for tenors. Again, depends. I'm not going to say it's always the case one way or the other. Because there are always exceptions, and every voice is a rule unto itself, as Lamperti wrote. So it's I don't want to be too prescriptive here, but that is, I think, a much more useful way of thinking. That ensures you're already in the position and the sound for the high voice well before you get there. Yeah, so then you can turn. The voice can get much more squillante, much more powerful in the theater or the hall or wherever the hell you're singing, and you'll be able to save your voice a little bit of wear and tear. Now, I'm just going to show you a couple more examples just so I make my point really, really clear here. I don't want to be misunderstood. Other big requirement is the breath stays fairly substantially compressed. Yeah, we don't want to introduce a huge amount of airflow into this. The reason for that being, it's twofold actually. The too much airflow through the vocal folds, of course, isn't going to mean you're not going to be able to close them properly, or they should be closed in the onset and then they vibrate intensely together, only emitting the minimum possible degree of air. Think of the old candle in front of the mouth exercise. I think that's from Lamperti as well, actually, from memory. And the other factor is that the resonance of the voice will not work if there's too much air moving through the vocal tract. Think about it. So we rely on air vibrating inside cavities in the whole vocal tract in order to produce a sympathetic vibration, which creates the resonance when it matches strongly with the overtones being produced initially in the vocal folds. I hope that makes sense, right? Just think of a brass instrument as a really good example. So the player's lips blowing into the mouthpiece, yeah, okay? They're not blowing air directly into the instrument, but rather the pressure going into the instrument is sound pressure, right? Vibration, which is then picked up and harnessed in its various different harmonics by the still air within the valves of the rest of the instrument. And the voice is working basically the same way, more or less, yeah? There's not a huge amount of difference there. So I would suggest thinking in this way is going to be very, very useful for particularly with tenors and baritones, but for singers in general. Too much airflow is not going to make the voice easier. It's going to make it harder because you cannot harness these resonances. Now, I'm not saying there should be no sense of flow. There should be a sense of flow. And the covered position, right, this hootier lower larynx kind of sound, will give you that flowing kind of quality, that ease of emission very, very quickly. Okay, much better than simply pushing air or allowing a huge amount of air to pass through the voice. Very, very important to understand. The same thing is true, of course, for sopranos and mezzos. You guys will just get away with a greater degree of airflow. It doesn't mean that's how it should be. It just means you'll get away with it. So anyway, on to the other examples. Let me do a little bit this La Boheme phrase, because this is just a very clear. So listen, I'm going to do the first example in the higher position we typically hear in the upper middle for many tenors, a little bit of a nasally quality, yeah, and then applying an aggressive cover. And I'll try to do this relatively well. I'm not going to make an obviously terrible example, because I want to make a real life example of what this sounds like. So, quite okay. In a recording situation, that will often sound really good. The problem with that is that in the theater, the passaggio is going to get much, much smaller. Probably some of you even thought that was really good because it sounds darker on the recording, right? But that darkness is deceptive. It doesn't carry. It's not big. It's not voce squillante. Okay, now let me show you with the ring. Now, you probably heard a difference then, right? You heard the squillo, which is that bright ringing E quality in the sound up top. Okay, it's going to feel a lot more frontal in its resonance. It's going to feel as if the voice picked up a lot of mask resonance, as some people like to say. Really, that's just associated with the strong presence of the squillo, right? It's why people go on and on and on about it. In every era, because that sense of the voice ringing forward strongly associated with the right sound being present, yeah, the right coordination, the right sound together. And you probably heard the upper middle took on a darker, more flowing quality. Now, you guys can disagree in the comments, whatever. I can assure you, in the theater, that's way, way, way louder. Okay, it feels more stable. When I work with people and bring out this squillo in the voice, it is incredible how much bigger, how much easier, and how much more stable the voices get. And this is for both men and women. This is not just a tenor baritone thing. Yeah, really, you can get a lot more out of the voice than you would expect is possible. I've often heard singers on recordings on either YouTube or CD or whatever, and thought, oh, this guy sounds incredible. This girl sounds incredible. Whoever it is, they sound really, really good. Dark, warm voice. Wow, it sounds like Giacomini or something. Then you see that same singer in the theater, and that impression of the voice isn't there anymore. Suddenly, you hear this kind of airy sound. It's kind of loose and a little bit dull, and the high notes don't really pick up in strength the same way they sound like they do on the recording. Now, I promise you that is to do with the acoustic effect of the voice in the theater. What sounds good on recording is not always what sounds good in the house. The same thing is also true the other way around. Sometimes I've heard a singer on a recording, YouTube, whatever. You very often will hear a singer that's some kind of piggish and noisy and like bleh, a little bit gross on a recording. But then you hear them in the theater and you're like, holy shit, this person sings with real squealer. It's crazy the difference these things make. And that singer will always win in the house, always. It's the reason this was a technical ideal for centuries and centuries and centuries, but for some reason has kind of been forgotten. People talk about placing in the mask, you know. That's also not what I'm advocating. That's this kind of, let me show you that. That would sound like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like superficially a pingy kind of sound. But because I'm thinking of just shoving the voice forward, raising the larynx basically, it's not really going to have the same acoustic brilliance as the squillante sound because, well, first of all, the acoustical and functional conditions are not present to allow that to happen. That will kind of sound like a buzzsaw in the room. In fact, even in the theater, it can sound very loud if you give it enough pressure, but it's not particularly aesthetic or heroic or warm or artistic in my opinion, and you're not really gonna get very much out of your voice doing that. Mind you, some people have sung very successfully for a number of years like that. Depends. I mean, if the voice is light enough, I think it can honestly take quite a lot. And if a person's strong enough, they can sustain quite a lot. But often people who sing in these ways will run into problems at some point or other. And I think that's really the issue. What works when you're 25 well enough won't necessarily keep working into your 40s. Yeah, it's just unfortunate, but that is the case. Whereas the reason that those older singers, and again, some singers today, I'm not saying there's no one singing well anymore. I definitely don't think that. How can they be so consistent for so many years and make such crazy loud ringing sounds that are so exciting while doing that? I mean, it seems superhuman, right? But they just understood, even if they didn't have the science behind it, how to leverage the acoustics of the vocal tract and how functionality and acoustics supported each other rather than a loud or ringing result necessarily being something dangerous or harmful or too intense to sustain. Anyway, I hope that's helpful for somebody out there. I hope my examples were clear enough to hear. As always, if you have any questions, please write in the comments below, and I would really, really appreciate any discussions there on what I'm talking about, because I think it's a really, really important part of technique that is often conflated together. You know, what is covering, what is turning, and why do we have so many overcovered singers now, but so few singers who actually turn the voice? What has been the shift in pedagogic thinking and the shift in singers' strategies that has led to that particular phenomenon? Let's talk about that in the comments a little bit. I want to get a little bit of discussion going here. It would be really, really nice to hear from some of you guys. Okay, then I'll see you next time.